meet last week. We had a special service, but the last time we met, we were in Daniel 9, and I want you to look at the 24th verse, and I want somebody to read that for me. And we'll be in Daniel, but we're going to be in several places. But Daniel 9:24. Somebody just read that one verse for us.
70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy.
70 weeks. Thank you, Larry. The most important two words of this prophecy, and I began to speak to you on that last time we met. And what are these 70 weeks? And when you examine the Hebrew, the word that is translated for you weeks does not mean weeks. Okay? So you need to understand that, because it's not that it's an inappropriate translation, because the translators are trying to help you understand the intent of what's being taught. But the word that's translated weeks means 7. So the real phrase, as it's spoken in the Word of God, is 70 sevens. And remember, I told you at that time in history, all systems, almost all mathematical systems, were based on sevens. Okay? So in that system, if you saw that number, what would that be? Based on the 7 system, that number equals 7. Okay? It's a complete, 1 unit complete. Okay? Now for us, that means 10, because we base everything on a 10 system in the way we think of everything. But that was not the Hebrews' mindset at that time in history. If you wanted to write the number 8, you would have a 1 7, and then the number 1 next to it equals 8. Just like for us, we have a 10 system. It means 1 10 and 1 more makes 11. Okay? Not hard to understand, but just a different way of thinking of things. And since that's the way they thought of things, it's important for us to understand how they thought. So, the idea then is that we have these 70 of sevens, and almost all evangelical Bible scholars refer to years rather than to weeks or other opportunities for 7. Okay? Why would you think that would be? Why would we be thinking years rather than other opportunities for 7? Because a week is an opportunity for a 7, right? But what other opportunities are there? Why are Bible scholars convinced that it refers to years and not to weeks? We'll go back to verse 2. Look at verse 2, and somebody read verse 2 for us.
In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years specified the word.
Okay, thank you, John. He's already thinking in context of years, okay? So most theologians will agree you carry that context over into what else he's talking about. And you'll see as we go along that years is the only thing that makes sense. So Daniel's thinking, in Daniel's mind, he's thinking 70 years and it's going to be all over. Is he not? He's thinking after 70 years, my people will come out of bondage in Babylonia and we'll go back to our promised land and everything will be all right. The problem is God's thinking something different, which Daniel does not yet understand. there will be a restoration to the land after 70 years, but there's a lot more. See, Daniel's thinking of restoration of the land. God is thinking restoration of his people. Because God has a plan. He has a plan for you. He has a plan for mankind, and that's the elimination of sin. I was reading today's paper, and there was a guy that quoted Luke 2 about peace on earth. And then he gave this big picture. He wrote an editorial on how we're going to achieve peace on earth. And he quoted from Luke 2, and he never mentioned God. Now, how in the world are you going to get peace on earth? I was amazed. I don't know why I read that stuff. It just aggravates me. But come on. God's got a plan, and God's going to take care of sin, and there will be peace on earth. Jesus is going to come with a rod of iron, and you know what? Sin. And see what happens then. The time of grace will end, but, so the idea then is we're talking about 77s, and if I had my notes in the right order, I could be a lot better at this. But another reason I believe it refers to years, and we need to discuss some of these things. The Jews, as I said, had a concept of weeks of years. For example, the Sabbath, it's actually Sabbath in Hebrew, the Sabbath rest of the land was supposed to occur how often? Every 7 years. A week of years, okay? Leviticus 25, 3 and 4 speaks to that. So there's 6 years where you work the land, you work it as hard as you can, and in that 7th year, you allow the land to rest. And so they see things there in terms of a week of 7, and 7 weeks of 7. What's the year that follows the 49th year in the Hebrew calendar? It's the year of Jubilee. What happens in the year of Jubilee? Everything goes back to what it was prior to the last Jubilee. If you've loaned somebody money and they owe you money on the year of Jubilee, you wipe off their loan. Yeah, can you see bankers doing that today? And you know what? After a while, the Jewish people, they were trying to figure out how to take advantage of some of those things. But 7 weeks of 7, 49th year, the year of Jubilee, estates were returned to people that may have been taken away from their original owners. Those properties went back to the original owners. Debts were forgiven. Slaves were actually freed under some criteria. So the idea of these groups of 7 weeks are very familiar to the Jewish way of thinking. And another reason I believe it refers to years is because the only other time Daniel ever uses the term Shabbat, Shabbat in the Hebrew is 7. In chapter 10, in verses 2 and 3, he refers to it. And he specifically speaks to weeks rather than how we have translated here in the prophecy to years. So to me, there's an obvious difference. He uses it, the Hebrew language is very specific in nature, okay? Not quite as specific as Greek, but very specific in nature. So when he uses 7 there in 10, 2, and 3, he uses a specific word for weeks, not 77s as he does in the prophecy. And there's just one other thought, and I mentioned this, I think, the last time we met. And Daniel was a quick study, you know. Daniel was a very intelligent man. And so Daniel would have understood this. He would have known that one of the reasons that the children of Israel were taken into captivity, one of several reasons, but one of the reasons they had continually violated the 7th year Sabbath repetitively, over and over. Why? Well, of course, they were disobedient, but mainly because they were greedy. They didn't want to let the land lie. They were self-indulgent. They were materialistic. And they worked the land for 6 years, and instead of letting it go in the 7th year to restore the land, they plowed the land. They were what they were supposed to do was let the land lay fallow, I think it's called, and they would just keep working, and they violated that 7th year Sabbat over and over and over, and that's one of the reasons that they were removed from the land, because I think God wanted to get his land to be restored. You know, Israel, for a small nation, has a great agricultural industry. When I was a commissary officer in Greece, we got all our lettuce, regular head lettuce, from Israel. They were at that time, they were the only country in Europe that was able to grow lettuce. I don't know if that's still true. But, so they have a great agricultural industry. Even though they're very small, they have very good, rich land that God has provided for them. So they had violated this 7th year Sabbat rest, and they wouldn't let the land rest. And then, so since they wouldn't let it rest, God said, okay, I'm going to show you. I'm going to let it rest. So he removed them from the land. In 2 Chronicles 36:21, it says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, when he talks about to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, he's talking about their captivity there. And then it says, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbats. Okay? And for as long as she lay desolate, she keeps Sabbat to fulfill. And then he says, 70 years, which is how long? 70 years. How long were they held in captivity? 70 years. See, the number 7, there's great significance. And I'm not a numerologist. I'm not one of those people. I'm not like Madonna. I'm not into Kabbalah. I'm not into those false religions. But numbers do have significance for the Lord. They speak to you. He speaks through those. So this is a tremendous truth here. God says you're going to stay out of the land for 70 years, and they know why. There's a realization in their mind, because they had violated the Sabbats. You know how many they violated? They violated. You know how many they violated? They violated 70. 70 times they had not celebrated and adhered to God's rule and God. See, God is very exacting. God is very just, he's righteous, and he's very exacting. So if you're going to ignore him, he's going to get your attention. So, then it seems that the Spirit of God is telling us that, they had violated 70 Sabbats, and in that 70 Sabbats would be a time frame, if you think of it, 7 times 7, of how many years? 490 years, and 490 years will become very significant for us as we go through this prophecy. So, in the 800 years as a nation, they had violated 70, they had been a nation 70, they violated 70 Sabbats in their 800-year history. And so God uses the same number of years violated as the basis for his future plan, okay? And we'll see that as it unfolds for us here. And each year in captivity was one for the 7 years. So it has a dual emphasis, the 70 years in bondage, and then we're going to see it reflected in the 490 years we're going to be looking at also. But God is very exacting. So I believe then, without going any further, that these are weeks of years. I read this commentary, I thought I would quote it for you. It says, well, we can't be sure they're years. They might be just symbolic of movements. They might mean weeks or long periods. That's real exact. I'm gonna write a book. But
He's real sure of himself, isn't he?
Helping you a lot.
yeah, really. That's what happens. People get they get enamored with things and then they get brain fatigue. But Daniel evidently didn't have any problems with 70 years. Daniel understood what God was saying. So what's the length of these years? How long is a year? How many days?
Like a clean year.
Can't be 365. I'll show you why. If you want to know, do you want to know why?
Yeah.
We need to know why if we're going to figure out how many days, correct? Okay. So, in Daniel's time, there were really two calendars. In Daniel's time, the pagan calendar had 365 days. The calendar that the Jews used had 360 days. Let me show you how I can prove that to you. And it's important for us to understand, because 5 days will have a big impact when we figure out all these years. It's going to have a great impact. But so just stay with me. This is where we're going to separate the men from the boys and the girls from the ladies and all that. In the book of Genesis, and you don't have to open Genesis, you can write this down, or I may have put it on the outline. When you examine the flood, yeah, I know, and you're thinking to yourself, now he's going to teach us Genesis. Not a bad idea. I love Genesis. It is a long book, though. I may not have that long a lifetime. But it says in Genesis 7:11, just hang with me, you don't need to turn there, but in 7:11 it says, the flood began on the 17th day of the second month, okay? 17th day of the second month, and it came to an end on the 17th day of the 7 months. It's 2 to 7. How many months is that? 5 months. Now, so we know how many months it was, okay? It was 5 months. And you're going to say, well, why does that matter? Well, Genesis 7:24 and 8:3, the Bible says the flood lasted 150 days. 150 divided by 5 equals, and that's how many months, according to the Word of God, the flood lasted. So, and that's not how many days it rained, that's how long the flood lasted. So, with that in mind, 30 days, we're talking about 30 days, 12 30-day months equals a 360-day year, okay? So, that's the calendar that the Jews would have functioned under at that time. And all the months or when you examine, if you go, and you can examine this, if you go and examine the Word of God in the early portions of the Word, everything is based on a 30-day month. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But and then what they would do to catch up with the solar calendar every once in a while, and it wasn't always at the same time, they would add an extra month to the calendar to catch up with the solar movements, because everything is based on the sun in regards to that, okay? So, and then in another, just so you'll understand, just so you won't think I'm making this up, in Daniel 7, it says in Daniel 7 that the great tribulation will last for a time, and then it says 2 times, which makes 3, and a half a time. That's a half. That little finger there, that's a half. I got little hands anyway, so that's a half. And then Revelation 13 says that the great tribulation will last how long? It says 42 months, okay, and 42 months correlates to 3.5 years. And then in 12:6 in Revelation it says the tribulation will last 1,260 days. That is then a factor of 30, okay? 30 times 42 months equals 1,260. From all of those things, then, when we put them all together, we can glean, we're speaking months of 30 days. There's no other way that we can account for it. So again, we find not only in Genesis, but in Revelation, the Bible, even from the time of Genesis, all the way through the book of Revelation, when you speak Bible time, always think 30-day months. Always. From all the way from Genesis to Revelation, God is constant in the way he counts months, 30-day months. So Daniel has a prophetic calendar, and he would, and Daniel wouldn't have used the pagans' calendar. The Babylonians used a calendar based upon 365 days, but he wouldn't have used that. So if we have a period of 490 years of 360 days, that's what we're going to be looking at. 490 years of 360-day years, okay? And so then, to begin the prophecy, to begin the examination of the timeline of the prophecy, the first thing you have to do is figure out, when did it begin? Now some guys will figure from the opposite direction. That's cheating. Can't do that. If you're going to figure it out, you got to figure it out the way it's professed in the Word of God. So, when did this time period begin? Because we can find it, we can figure it out. I think we can figure it out. I think I can show you when it begins. So, let's find out when it begins. Verse 25 in your in our source document. Somebody read verse 25. What's he say in verse 25 of Daniel 9?
Go therefore and understand.
Okay, stop. Let me go therefore and understand. That's a very important phrase. He says that several times. In other words, pay attention to me. Because this isn't easy, Daniel. This isn't easy. It's not easy for me. Pay attention. Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
That from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince.
Okay. So, from the going forth of the what? The command to rebuild Jerusalem. That's the start date. There's only one problem. There's 4 decrees that all pertain to rebuilding in Jerusalem. So, but they're all different. And I'll try to tell you which one I think it is. And you probably agree with me, you probably already know. So we know the beginning is to the command to restore and build Jerusalem. But, like I said, there's 4 commands. There's one in Ezra, one by Cyrus, one by Darius, one by Artaxerxes. The first one in Ezra is by Cyrus, and there's a second one by Artaxerxes. Okay. So, so they are all on different dates. So if you start at one of them and you're wrong, you'll end up on the wrong date on the end. Okay, so that's how we'll try to examine them. The first one is the decree by Cyrus. First chapter of Ezra, if you're interested where it's at. So the first, some will say the first decree by Cyrus is the one. And the reasoning behind that, most of theologians that say that is because of Isaiah 44, where the Bible tells us that Cyrus would be the servant of God who would lead the people or let the people go back to the land to rebuild rebuild. He would be the one that would allow them to return and rebuild. So those that say that it's from this first decree of Cyrus would say that the 490-year calendar then begins with his first decree. And okay, so you know when that was. It was 536 BC. Okay? So, if it's in 536 BC, if we begin with 536 BC and we go from there, and if you notice over in verse 27, there's another section there that actually says, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. What does that mean? You know what that does to your 70 years? It means that you've taken 1 year away. So you're not really working with a 70-year calendar. You're working with a 69-week calendar. There's a break, and we'll talk about the break. A lot of people think the break is man-made. I think the break is God-made, but I'll elaborate that when we get to that point. But it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So the 70th week is cut off to 69. We can't count that one. So we'll see where that comes in later. Going back to verse 25, it begins with a command to rebuild Jerusalem, and it goes until what? What did you say, Chris? Are you still there? When does it end? Huh?
Until Messiah the Prince.
So it starts with rebuild Jerusalem. Jerusalem. You know what the original name of Jerusalem was? Salem. That's knowledge that you don't need, but I've just given it to you anyway. And it ends with what? The recognition of the Messiah? Can I say that? I'm going to say that because it fits. In my mind, it fits. Okay? Rebuild Jerusalem. And the 69 weeks will end with the recognition of the Messiah. And because really what happens here, we're broken down into really, we have, there'll be 7 weeks in 62 weeks. How much is 62? Well, how much is a score? Remember Abraham Lincoln?
362.
Yeah. A score is 20 years. 62 then is 62. So we have 7 and 62 to make 69, and then we have a week that we'll talk about later. So the first 69, or 483 years of the 490 years, start with a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, and they end with the beginning of the end of the Messiah, we could almost say. So some scholars say it has to be the first decree of Cyrus because of Isaiah 44, 28 to 44, where Isaiah 24 to 28, Isaiah said Cyrus would make this decree and so forth. But you know what happens when you go for 483s from 536? You end up with 50, I think it's 54 BC. 54 BC. That's kind of an unusual date. What's the significance of 54 BC? Well, you can't have a Messiah before there's a Christ. And so I have a problem with that idea that it's the first decree. In fact, Christ really doesn't begin his ministry until around 30 AD. So that's off like, if it's 30 AD, that's off like 80 years. 54 down, 30 going into the BC. It's close, but remember, we've already seen God's pretty exacting. He's not into closeness. He's perfect in his math. So we know, but people that believe in that first theory will say that the solution is the Ptolemaic calendar. Are you familiar with Ptolemy? Ptolemy, with a silent P, had a theory of, it's called the Ptolemaic calendar, and because of that theory, some people say the years are off and that this 54 BC isn't really 54 BC, it's a later date. But Ptolemy started a point of theory. He was considered to be, he was a genius of his time. He lived around 150 AD, and he wrote a book about it was called A Planetary Hypothesis, and in his book, but the problem with his book was the earth was the center of everything, and everything revolved around the earth, the sun, the stars, the moon, which wasn't an unusual thought for that time in history. But some people believe that the calendar is off, that these years are off because of the Ptolemaic system. But to me, that's not a solution. You can't prove it's off because of the Ptolemaic system. If I showed you all of that, we could spend about 3 or 4 weeks on that one item alone. So I'm going to say under the first decree, we come up 80 years short. So that's off. To me, that's not convincing. And God's word has to be convincing. It has to be convicting, in fact. So I don't accept the first decree as the time when the calendar began on this prophecy. There's no proof to that. I'll tell you another reason why. Because the first decree of Cyrus does not fill the criteria. The criteria is what? Again, Chris, are you still there? To rebuild what? And the first decree of Cyrus is not to rebuild Jerusalem. The first decree of Cyrus is to rebuild the temple. And wrong answer. Can't be the right answer. Sorry. So, and then really nobody says the second decree has a chance. And when you say Cyrus and Darius, you're actually saying the same person. And then, so they'll jump to the third one, which is the first decree of Artaxerxes. And that happened in 458. So we're getting better, okay? 458 BC, okay? And that's actually moving about, 90 years ahead? 536 to 458. I'm not sure how many, I didn't write down. So we're making up ground though. And 458, if we take 483 years, that's our 69 weeks, is 483, we end up, we end up now with, we're going to get to
Your arrow needs to change.
25 AD, okay? Because we took away these years, we went 458 years, and we end up with, that's AD, not AP, 25 AD. That's pretty close, huh? That's a lot closer than 54 BC. But what happened in 25 AD? I don't know. Jesus was still, Jesus wasn't really a carpenter. That word that's translated in the Greek, you know what it means? He was a builder, exactly. He was a mason, probably. In fact, some of the ruins that you can go over and examine in Nazareth and stuff are things he might have built, or at least his father probably built, and he probably built with his father. He was a builder. Bob the builder. Jesus the builder of men. So, the closest thing then, you might consider the baptism, but I have an issue with the baptism because I don't think that's a presentation as the Messiah. The baptism is a presentation of the Father's approval. It's not a presentation of the Messiah. The baptism really was between two individuals, God and his Son. And what did he tell them?
This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased.
He told them of his pleasing. In fact, the word infers that the people may not have even understood what was going on. It was as if it was a noise to them. God speaks as God will speak. So I'm not real hip on the idea that it might have been baptism. Baptism is closer to 25 AD, but nothing. So
we're shooting for when he was crucified?
well, when was he? When? Well, I'll get there, and I'm going to get there tonight. I'll get there within 5 minutes. So the first decree of Artaxerxes, or another problem with the first decree of Artaxerxes was there's nothing in it about rebuilding the city, only the temple. And that's a big deal. When the word says rebuild Jerusalem, you know what? It means they had to be told, you can go rebuild Jerusalem now. It doesn't mean you can go rebuild the temple, because that's not Jerusalem. So, in my mind, then that leaves us only one place to go. The second decree of Artaxerxes. The fourth decree in the line. And if you want to read, boy, you're going to want to read. The best thoughts in regards to this is written in a book by Sir Robert Anderson. And Sir Robert Anderson was an investigator at Scotland Yard. And he was a thorough dude. And he lived about 100 years ago. And there's probably 200 pages of charts of years in his examination of the time frame of the 70-week prophecy. The book is called The Coming Prince, if you're interested. It's one of those books, if you read it in bed, prop your eyelids open. But, and then there's a book from Dr. Daniel Hoyner, Houhner, I believe it's spelled, from Dallas Theological Seminary. Nikki's brother graduated from Dallas Theological. I have a lot of respect for the professors there. I think Dr. Hoyner just died 2 or 3 years ago. And he examines Anderson's timeline, and he wrote a book, it's called The Chronological Aspects of Jesus Christ. It examines not only the 70-week prophecy, the crucifixion, all those timelines. And Dr. Hoyner ends up with like a 1-year difference between Anderson and himself. And if you're going to write a book, you need to have a difference. Because if you agree with everybody, nobody's going to buy your book. You're going to say, I already read that, why am I going to buy that book? So I'm going to write a book that disagrees about something, I don't know. But those are two great thoughts by men much more intelligent than I about this whole thing. And it really, I've used them as I've tried to study this prophecy. So but in the first 3 decrees, and you can go examine them all, they're all in the Word. No authorization is given to rebuild the city. So it can't start there. And in fact, it's most interesting when you read in Ezra. I was reading in Ezra to check it all out. When they are given the permission to rebuild the temple in Ezra chapter 4, it says that they were stopped for a while in their building. You know why? Because they thought they were trying to rebuild the city, and they did not have a permit to rebuild their city. So the people around the Jews, because the people around the Jews weren't real happy when they were rebuilding the temple, and later when they would rebuild Jerusalem, they were watching them to make sure they didn't rebuild the city. They had a lot of enemies. And so this final decree of Artaxerxes is the only decree that fits at all with the timeline. And if you look at that decree, Nehemiah, of course, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I'll just read what it says in chapter 2, verse 1. I don't want to spend a lot more time there. It says in chapter 2, it came to pass in the month of Nisan, they named the month after the car, all the way back there, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king. And then it goes on to say that he made the decree, and you can read down to verse 8. But I want you, the important part is the month of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. And when did Artaxerxes begin to reign? That's a historical fact. We know when he began to reign. And historians tell us he is seated to the throne. Then we're going to put in this date at, I think it's 465 BC. I think that's right. 465 BC. And you know where you can find that on Wikipedia. And you know what? If it says it in Wikipedia, it must be true. You know how those things are in Wikipedia? You can put them in there if you want. Anybody can put them in there. So everything you read in Wikipedia, you have to examine it. Because some of it is utterly ridiculous. Actually, the Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica will say 465 BC. And that's an established fact. So his 20th year then, if he is seated to the throne in 465, would be what, Renee? 445, okay? So that's the beginning date. If he is seated in 465, he came to the throne in 465. 20 years later, we make it 445, we're going down. And according to Anderson's calculations, the years of a king's reign were from the first month of his reign, so it would be of Nisan 1. And if it begins on the first of the month of Nisan, then we would come down to this decree taking place in 445, okay? 1 Nisan 445. In our calendar, that would be 14th of March, if you wanted to know. 14th of March. So 445 BC. And then from there, you start subtracting 483 years. Okay? Are you still with me? I haven't lost you? That's the first 69 weeks. So when did it end? It says when they do what? Read that again for me, Chris. What about the Messiah?
To restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince.
Until Messiah the Prince. Oh, God, that's a good phrase. So, Messiah the Prince. So that's the ending of it. So we're going to have 7 weeks, 2 weeks, 69 weeks. And, you know, when you read in the New Testament, it says all during this time. Have you ever thought why it's divided into 7 weeks and then 62 weeks? Have you ever examined that? Do you know what happened at the end of the first 7 weeks? The Old Testament was finished. Yeah. Not only was the Old Testament finished, the rebuilding of Jerusalem was finished. God's perfect. He's exact. Everything. Down to the what is it, the tittle and the dot on the I, and God is perfect. That's why you can't mess with this stuff. Have I answered your question yet, Betsy? I forgot what it was.
Well, you subtract this, then it puts you at.
Oh, yeah,
38,
okay.
80
So how,
years.
what does it take me to?
38, 80, 30,
I don't think so.
33.
Yeah. So let me continue. I'll try to get there before I stop. So, when you read in the Old Testament, these are called, in the King James, it calls them troublous times. I love the King James. These were troublous times. And if you study the book of Nehemiah, you'll find out there was a lot of trouble. People were upset that they were rebuilding. It was a troublous time. But at the end of the thing is that when you take that first configuration of time, you come to 396 BC, and 396 BC is when these guys close their mouths. You know who they are? The guys. There's a cessation to the words of the prophets. In 396 BC, the prophets no longer speak. And we go into what we call the intertestamental period, where God does not speak. I'm sure he still talked to people, but he did not speak through his prophets. Who's the next prophet? Who's the first prophet of the New Testament?
John.
Yeah, the locust eater. John the Baptist.
Sticking in honey.
Yeah. Anything in honey is good for you. You know that. I saw some of that advertised in the paper today. Honey for everything. Blood pressure, everything that's wrong with you, you can fix with honey, as long as you mix it with the right stuff. And if you'll buy a book, it'll tell you what to mix it with.
Yeah.
But the Old Testament canon is completed at this time. So God established, think of it, God has established his people back in their city, in their, where they're supposed to be. The temple has been rebuilt. All these things have come to fruition, all perfectly. The words that are used is, they have repaired the city square, which alludes to the interior of the city has been reestablished. So God has affirmed his people again, his city, his word, the Old Testament, that portion of his word has been put aside. And so when we get back then, where do we end up? Let me try to, I'm going to skip ahead in my notes so I can, somebody,
So you're starting at 396 now?
no, I'm not starting at 396, I'm still starting with when is Jesus spoken of as the Messiah? Mashiach Nagid. Mashiach Nagid is the word. And Mashiach Nagid is the same word that's used of King Saul. Okay, and what's significant about King Saul?
First king.
First king. Why? How? How was he made a king? He was anointed. By who? By God. Big deal. Mashiach Nagid. Okay? And that's the reference, that's the words that are used to refer to Christ as he enters into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So that's where I believe we will see this timeline taking us when I get there in my notes in the next couple of weeks. Okay? I keep telling you I'll be done in a week, but you know how that works.
Couple weeks.
Huh?
You said couple weeks.
Yeah, a couple weeks. Questions? Donna?
Kid,
I thought it was leading up to his birth. Did they refer to him as the Messiah at his birth?
When was he recognized as the Messiah? They may have referred to him as the Messiah at his birth. Who declared him to be? The angels told the shepherds. The Magi came a couple years later. They were on a different calendar. He is recognized. He is declared by God's people's own lips to be the Messiah when he enters on Palm Sunday.
literally laid the palms down.
Hosanna to the King. And he's referred to in the Word as the Mashiach Nagid, which is a very, very, very legal term in the Word of God.
What is Mashiach Nagid? What's his
It
name?
means ruler, holy ruler, Mashiach is Messiah, okay? Nagid is ruler. So,
Anointed one?
huh?
Anointed one?
Yeah, anointed one, separated one. It's really a legal term. It's actually hard to express in the English language. But we'll look at that a little bit more in next week's lesson. Anyone else? Right, save up your notes, Donna, and then bring them and ask me next week. But it's so important. The biggest thing tonight I wanted you to see is that I believe that you have to start with the fourth decree. It's the only decree that delineates that it's time to go and rebuild Jerusalem. And that's exactly what it says in Daniel. All the other decrees say you can go and rebuild your temple. And that doesn't fit the bill. So you have to start with the fourth decree. And if you're going to start with the fourth decree, then that timeline is going to have to fit the events that are decreed in the prophecy. Okay? We'll look at it again next week. And remember, I handed you out some Clarence Larkin Daniel 70-week prophecy calendar. Yeah, Jim's got one there. You should refer back to those, and if you didn't get one, let me know and I'll get you one. But most of that, I don't believe with Larkin on everything. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's pretty darn close. So. Okay, anything else? 7:33, we're on overtime. You're gonna have to pay me time and a half now. Oh, we gotta have a business meeting. So we're gonna do a business meeting. If you're a guest, you can stay. If you don't wanna stay, you can leave. You'll see how we conduct business though. We're pretty formal. So I would like to call into order, New Life Family Worship Center,